What if everything we believed about the prison beneath the Euphrates was only the outer layer of a far greater mystery? Not long after the river uncovered new stretches of forgotten ground, reports began circulating among a handful of researchers about a chamber unlike anything previously documented. Hidden behind a collapsed wall of limestone was a passage descending deep beneath the exposed riverbed. There were no inscriptions identifying its builders, no traces of familiar civilizations, no evidence that human hands had ever shaped what lay below. The walls were impossibly smooth, interrupted only by geometric grooves that seemed less like decoration than components of an enormous machine. At the very center of the chamber rested a single object, an ancient leather scroll. Time should have destroyed it thousands of years ago, yet its surface remained strangely preserved, sealed beneath layers of mineral deposits that had protected it from the passing ages. When carefully unfolded, the explorers expected to find another forgotten map of an ancient kingdom. Instead, they found something no one was prepared to explain. Across its surface stretched an intricate design unlike any map ever discovered. There were no cities, no mountains, no rivers, only enormous concentric structures surrounding one unmistakable location, the Euphrates. But the river itself was not drawn as water. It appeared as the upper boundary of something buried far beneath it. The title, translated only after months of painstaking analysis, carried a name that sent chills through every scholar who studied it: the Chronology of the Abyss. It was not a record of places. It was a record of time. Every symbol described cycles rather than distances. Every circle represented stages rather than territories. What appeared at first to be decorative markings slowly revealed themselves as an enormous sequence of interconnected locks, layered one beneath another, descending into unimaginable depths. Then came the discovery that changed everything. The structure beneath the Euphrates was never described as a prison. It was described as a containment mechanism. The distinction was terrifying. A prison exists to confine prisoners. A containment system exists to restrain something that cannot simply be locked away. According to the scroll, the river itself functioned as only the visible surface of an immense biological and spiritual seal. A living boundary designed not merely to imprison, but to stabilize a force capable of disrupting both the physical and unseen worlds. The deeper researchers examined the diagrams, the stranger the symbols became. Several markings resembled veins instead of tunnels. Others resembled pulses instead of roads. Entire sections appeared to imitate living tissue, woven together with impossible geometry, as though the mechanism beneath the earth had never been built at all. It had grown. But the greatest horror was hidden near the edge of the scroll. A circular sequence of ancient symbols formed what looked unmistakably like a countdown. For centuries, the markings progressed with perfect mathematical precision. Then, suddenly, the intervals changed. The final symbols were compressed together. Entire cycles had disappeared. Something had accelerated the chronology itself. Not the prediction, not the prophecy, the mechanism. And if the scroll was correct, the countdown beneath the Euphrates is no longer moving according to the ancient timetable. It is moving faster, much faster. Because whatever was designed to remain dormant until the appointed hour has already begun responding long before that hour was ever expected to arrive. At first, the symbols appeared chaotic. Lines crossed without pattern, circles overlapped impossible angles. Entire sections seemed deliberately designed to confuse anyone attempting to read them as ordinary cartography. But after months of digital reconstruction, something extraordinary emerged. The scroll was never intended to be viewed as a flat image. It was a three-dimensional blueprint. Layer after layer aligned like transparent sheets, revealing a structure buried far below the river, a structure so immense that no previous archaeological model could even accommodate its scale. The prison beneath the Euphrates was not a single chamber. It was an entire subterranean complex. Its outer boundaries stretched for distances impossible to calculate from the surface alone, while dozens of enormous cavities surrounded one central void that dominated every layer of the design. Yet the architecture itself raised even more disturbing questions. Nothing resembled human engineering. There were no supporting columns in the conventional sense, no load-bearing walls, no foundations. Instead, gigantic hexagonal shafts intersected one another at impossible angles, distributing force through geometric patterns that modern structural physics struggles to explain. It looked less like a building and more like crystallized mathematics. Researchers noticed another unsettling feature. Every corridor curved with astonishing precision toward the same invisible center. No matter where a passage began, it ultimately bent inward, as though every part of the structure obeyed a single command. Everything pointed downward, deeper, closer to whatever occupied the heart of the abyss. The deeper the geometry was analyzed, the stranger the conclusions became. Measurements repeated with astonishing consistency. Ratios appeared that mirrored celestial mechanics. Angles corresponded to astronomical alignments separated by thousands of years. The builders had not merely created underground chambers. They had synchronized the entire structure with the movement of the heavens, as though time itself formed part of the locking mechanism. Then came another discovery. Scattered throughout the blueprint were enormous circular formations that early researchers assumed were ceremonial halls. They were wrong. Each circle connected directly to dozens of surrounding passages. Each contained identical symbols, indicating continuous movement. The chambers were not rooms. They were regulators. Massive components designed to absorb, redirect, and distribute an invisible force flowing throughout the entire complex. The scroll never described this force. It simply referred to it using a symbol translated as the breath below. No explanation followed. Only repeated warnings that every regulator must remain synchronized. One failed. All failed. Suddenly, details that once seemed decorative took on terrifying significance. Thin, branching lines spread across every level of the blueprint. At first glance, they resembled cracks. Magnified, they resembled veins. More precisely, they resembled a circulatory system. The containment complex did not merely surround the abyss, it interacted with it. It responded. It adapted. Some researchers proposed an unsettling possibility. Perhaps the mechanism beneath the Euphrates was never constructed in the way humans build cities or temples. Perhaps it had been cultivated, grown over unimaginable ages according to laws completely foreign to human civilization. A machine that behaved like a living organism. Then they reached the final layer of the blueprint. There, surrounding the central void, lay 12 immense containment rings. 11 were marked with the same ancient symbol, stable. The 12th was different. Its inscription had been deliberately scratched away. Across its surface ran dozens of fresh fractures absent from every previous section of the scroll. Not damage to the parchment, damage to the design itself. As though whoever recorded the chronology of the abyss had returned one final time, only to witness that the outermost containment ring had already begun to fail. And if the blueprint was accurate, the first barrier was no longer holding. The blueprint had revealed the structure. Now, the chronology revealed its condition. Until this point, researchers believed the symbols represented fixed architecture, unchanging, eternal, immune to the passing of time. But when every surviving fragment of the scroll was digitally reconstructed, another pattern emerged. The markings had changed. Tiny variations appeared between layers that had originally been dismissed as copying errors. Yet they were too precise to be accidental. Every alteration followed the same direction. The seals were evolving. It was as if the map had never been intended to describe a single moment in history. Instead, it documented a process, a slow transformation unfolding across thousands of years. Then came the discovery no one expected. Hidden beside the outer containment rings were dozens of microscopic symbols, almost invisible to the naked eye. Under magnification, they formed a second network of coordinates. Unlike everything else on the scroll, these markings pointed upward, toward the surface. When When the coordinates were compared with modern satellite surveys, the room fell silent. They aligned, not approximately, not symbolically, exactly. Every marked location corresponded with a specific point above the buried complex. Ancient writers had somehow mapped positions that would only become meaningful thousands of years later. Even more unsettling was what those locations represented. They were not entrances. They were stress points. Each coordinate identified a section where the outer containment system would experience its greatest strain during the final phase of the chronology. One by one, researchers examined geological reports from those same regions. Unexpected tremors, localized ground deformation, unexplained magnetic disturbances, low-frequency vibrations detected beneath solid rock. Individually, none of these anomalies seemed extraordinary. Together, they formed the exact sequence illustrated on the scroll. The first stress point had already activated, then the second, then the third. Each event matched the chronology with impossible precision. The ancient mechanism was behaving exactly as predicted, but the scroll offered another warning. The regulators described earlier were never designed to stop the force below forever. Their purpose was different. They distributed pressure. Every intact seal carried a fraction of the burden. As long as every layer remained synchronized, the system remained stable. But if one regulator weakened, the pressure shifted to the next, then the next, and then another. The process became exponential. Failure would not spread in a straight line, it would accelerate. The illustrations made this horrifyingly clear. Fine fractures appeared around one ring. Later diagrams showed those fractures multiplying. Then, entire sections darkened. Finally, every outer seal began failing simultaneously. There would be no gradual collapse, only a chain reaction. Researchers gave the phenomenon a simple name: cascade failure. Once initiated, nothing inside the mechanism could reverse it. Then attention turned toward the deepest chamber. Unlike every outer layer, its symbols had never changed across thousands of years of recorded chronology. It remained perfectly still, perfectly silent, almost patient. Whatever existed beneath the final seal was not causing the instability. It was waiting for the instability to reach it. The outer containment layers were never the prison itself. They were buffers, sacrificial barriers designed to absorb unimaginable pressure until the appointed sequence was complete. The scroll ended this section with a single line, carved larger than every other inscription. Not a prophecy, not a warning, an instruction. Do not mistake silence for absence. Because beneath the Euphrates, the silence had already begun to crack. Every chronology reaches a final entry. According to the scroll, there was never meant to be an endless cycle of containment. Every ring, every regulator, every hidden chamber beneath the Euphrates existed for one purpose alone: to delay a moment that had already been written long before human history began. Then the sequence reached its final mark. The last symbols on the chronology of the abyss did not describe an explosion. They described a silence so complete that every moving part of the mechanism stopped at the exact same instant. For a single moment, nothing happened. No vibration, no shifting stone, no movement within the endless labyrinth below. The entire structure appeared frozen, suspended between two realities. Then the first lock disengaged, not with violence, but with precision. One enormous containment ring rotated only a few degrees before disappearing into darkness beneath the next layer. Seconds later, another followed, then another. The ancient blueprint had warned that the collapse would not begin from the center. It would begin at the edges. The outer rings surrendered one after another, transferring impossible pressure inward until every remaining barrier carried more force than it had ever been designed to withstand. The cascade had become unstoppable. Across the immense underground complex, Luminous symbols that had burned for ages faded into blackness. Massive geometric regulators ceased their silent rotation. The living veins that once pulsed through the walls hardened into lifeless stone. The mechanism was dying, yet something else was awakening. At the center of the abyss stood the final seal. Unlike the others, it had never been mechanical. The scroll illustrated it differently, as a perfect circle without joints, hinges, or visible locks. It resembled less a door than a boundary, woven directly into reality itself. Hairline fractures appeared across its surface. Each fracture emitted a faint crimson glow, spreading with impossible symmetry until the entire seal resembled shattered glass, still somehow holding together. Then came the final inscription. There were no more diagrams, no explanations. Only 4 words, written larger than everything before them. The boundary withdraws itself. Not broken, not destroyed. Withdrawn. As though the seal had never been forcing itself closed, it had simply chosen to remain shut. Until now. Without warning, the crimson fractures connected. The circle dissolved into countless fragments of light. They did not fall. They vanished. Beyond the opening there was no fire, no molten earth, no cavern walls. Only darkness. Not the darkness of an underground chamber, a depth so absolute that distance itself seemed meaningless. Then, a pulse. Not outward, upward. An invisible wave moved through every remaining level of the structure. Walls trembled, pillars groaned. Entire chambers collapsed into the void as if gravity itself had changed direction. Far below, enormous silhouettes shifted for the first time in ages beyond memory. Nothing fully emerged. Nothing could yet be clearly seen. Only movement. Slow, deliberate, ancient. The chronology of the abyss ended at that exact moment. Not because the story was over, but because everything written after that point would no longer be prophecy. It would become history. The ancient scroll never described the end of the world. It described the end of a separation. For generations, humanity imagined the final moment as an instant of overwhelming catastrophe. Fire falling from the heavens, mountains collapsing, oceans consuming the land. But the chronology of the abyss told a different story. Its final pages suggested that the greatest transformation would begin almost unnoticed. The first change would not appear in the earth. It would appear in perception. According to the scroll, the containment system beneath the Euphrates had never protected the world by imprisoning something below. It had protected the world by preserving a boundary. As long as that boundary remained intact, reality itself maintained a delicate balance. When the final seal withdrew, that balance shifted. Not violently, gradually. The ancient manuscript referred to this transition with a phrase that appeared nowhere else in the document. The veil becomes thin. No explanation followed, only descriptions. Places once considered ordinary would begin to feel strangely unfamiliar. Silence would carry unusual weight. Ancient sites would seem different without changing at all. People separated by continents would report similar dreams despite never meeting one another. Moments of déjà vu would become increasingly difficult to dismiss as coincidence. The scroll insisted these were not supernatural attacks. They were symptoms. Evidence that 2 realities once separated by an immeasurable boundary were beginning to overlap. It compared the process to light passing through fractured crystal. The light itself never changes, only the way it is perceived. Researchers studying the final illustrations noticed something extraordinary. The shattered containment rings beneath the Euphrates were never shown releasing armies across the landscape. Instead, they emitted invisible waves spreading in perfect circles across the entire world. The manuscript identified them as resonance, not destruction, synchronization. Every expanding circle carried the same implication. The world above had begun responding to the world below. Then came the most unsettling passage of all. It claimed humanity had misunderstood the purpose of the ancient mechanism from the very beginning. The seals were never protecting the abyss from us. They were protecting us from the abyss. Not because what lay beneath sought immediate conquest, but because its mere presence altered everything around it. The closer the boundary became, the more reality itself adapted. Time seemed different. Memory became uncertain. Long-forgotten fears resurfaced without explanation. The manuscript warned that civilizations throughout history had mistaken these subtle changes for political collapse, cultural upheaval, or natural disaster. Yet beneath every crisis, another process had quietly continued. The boundary had been weakening, generation after generation, century after century, until the chronology reached its final page. The scroll ended not with a vision, but with a question. If humanity had lived its entire history behind an invisible barrier, who would we become once that barrier no longer existed? Perhaps the greatest mystery was never what waited beneath the Euphrates. Perhaps the greatest mystery was what the world would become after it no longer stood between us and whatever had always been waiting beyond the veil. History has always remembered the Euphrates as a river. The chronology of the abyss remembered it differently. Its final pages never described flowing water as the true boundary. Water was only the visible sign of something far older, a veil placed over a mechanism that humanity was never meant to fully understand. Perhaps that is why so many ancient civilizations treated rivers with reverence, not because they feared the current, but because they feared what the current concealed. The manuscript ends with an unusual silence. There are no victorious heroes, no final battle, no explanation of what comes next. Instead, the unknown author leaves behind one haunting observation. The first generation never notices the change. At first, those words seem almost disappointing. After everything the scroll revealed, why end with such a quiet sentence? Then its meaning begins to unfold. The greatest transformations in history rarely announce themselves. Empires collapse one decision at a time. Forests disappear one tree at a time. Faith fades one generation at a time. Perhaps the boundary beneath the Euphrates was never meant to vanish in a single moment either. Perhaps the most profound changes are the ones people slowly accept as normal. That possibility is far more unsettling than any sudden catastrophe. Because if reality itself shifts gradually, who can recognize the exact moment it became different? The chronology never instructed its readers to fear the abyss. It instructed them never to forget that boundaries exist for a reason. Throughout history, humanity has repeatedly crossed limits it barely understood. Some boundaries protected kingdoms, others protected knowledge, and according to this forgotten manuscript, one protected the world itself. Whether the scroll was an elaborate warning, an ancient allegory, or the fragmented memory of a forgotten civilization, its message remains strangely timeless. Every generation inherits mysteries it did not create. Every generation decides whether to ignore them or to investigate them. Perhaps the greatest danger has never been hidden beneath the earth. Perhaps it has always been human certainty, the belief that everything important has already been discovered. History has humbled that belief before, again and again. So the next time you hear the name Euphrates, remember that ancient traditions rarely preserved a place for only one reason. Sometimes a location becomes sacred because of what happened there. Sometimes because of what still remains there. And sometimes because it marks a boundary no one should be eager to cross. If the chronology of the abyss leaves us with one final lesson, it is this: not every mystery demands an answer. Some mysteries demand humility, because once a sealed door has been opened, no one can truly know what has been allowed to pass through. Thank you for joining us on this journey into one of the darkest mysteries preserved in ancient tradition. If you enjoy exploring biblical enigmas, forgotten manuscripts, and the hidden layers of prophecy, consider subscribing and joining us for the next investigation. Because history is filled with mysteries, but some mysteries may still be unfolding.